Hi there, I'm going to read Chapter 30 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. He awoke to a tugging motion. There was a low sound of wind and a lapping of water. The wind must have changed direction. He hadn't heard that for a long time. The boat was tugging a little to port, then after a time tugging back to starboard. Then after a long time another tug to port again, on and on. The port lights showed an overcast sky. Loneliness was what he always associated with these sounds and motions of the boat. A boat out on anchor exposed to a steady wind is almost always in some lonely place, a place only boats can go. It was a relaxing sound. Gray skies and wind mean a kind of day when it's pleasant not to go anywhere. Just putter around the cabin, fixing up things that you've been putting off, studying charts and harbor guides, and planning where you will be going. Then he remembered today he was going to go into town and try to get some food. Then he remembered Lila. Maybe today he'd find out if she was any better. He got out of the sleeping bag. When he put his feet down on the cabin sole, he didn't get the usual shock. The cabin thermometer showed 55 degrees. Not bad. The ocean was doing that. The lakes and canals back inland would start icing up in a month or so, but he doubted whether this water would freeze at all. The tides and currents would keep it moving. Certainly on the other side of this hook, the ocean never froze, so he had escaped that danger. He could always get out. The ice couldn't get him anymore. He stepped up the ladder, pushed open the hatch, and put his head out. It was beautiful. Gray skies, south wind, warm wind with an ocean smell in it. The other two boats that had been at anchor were gone. The curve of the hook concealed Manhattan and Brooklyn. All he could see across the bay to the west was a barge at anchor and a high-rise apartment from another world miles away. He suddenly felt a wild freedom. The change in the wind had placed his boat a little closer to shore now, and he noticed something he hadn't paid much attention to yesterday. The shore was piled with debris. There were plastic bottles, an old tire, and further off what looked like old creosoted telephone poles half buried in the sand, next to a boat hull with its transom knocked out. Sandy Hook seemed like some final resting place for all the junk of civilization that had come down the Hudson River. He looked at his watch, 9 o'clock. He'd really slept. He went back below, rolled up the sleeping bag, and put away the books and slips from last night's reading. He built a new fire, noting there were only about 2 days of charcoal left. When the fire was going, he went to the chart table and opened the second drawer down. He pulled out all the Hudson River charts, gathered them into a pile, and carried them to a bin above the settee berth, where he stored them. He wouldn't be needing those again. To take their place, he brought out a roll of charts from Sandy Hook to Cape May and the Delaware River. At the chart table, he unrolled them and studied each one. The coast had many little crisscross marks showing wrecks. Rigel had warned him not to get caught off the New Jersey shore in a northeaster, but it looked like an easy 3 days to Cape May if the weather was good, with an easy run to Manasquan Inlet and a longer one to Atlantic City. Phaedrus folded the charts and placed them in the chart table drawer. He prepared a simple breakfast for himself, ate it, and then made one for Lila. When he brought it in, she was awake. The swelling of her face didn't seem to have gone down much, but she was looking at him again, really looking at him now, making contact. "Why is the boat swinging?" she said. "It's all right," he said. "It's making me dizzy," she said. "Stop the boat from swinging." She's not only talking, he thought, she's complaining. That's real progress. "How does that eye feel?" he asked. "Awful. We can put hot rags on it or something." "No." "Well, here's breakfast anyway." "Are we at the island?" "We're at Sandy Hook, New Jersey." "Where is everybody?" "Where?" "On the island," she said. He didn't know what she was talking about, but something told him not to ask. "It's not an island, it's a spit of land. There's nobody here, at least on this part. Just a lot of junk lying around." "You know what I mean," she said. He sensed there was a problem coming up. If he rejected what she was telling him, then she'd reject him, and he didn't want that. She was trying to reach out to him now. He should try to meet her halfway. "Well, it's almost an island," he said. "Richard is coming." "Rigel?" She didn't say anything. He supposed she must mean Rigel. There weren't any other Richards. "Rigel said he was going to Connecticut to sell his boat," Phaedrus said. "This is New Jersey now, so he won't be coming this way." "Well, I'm ready," Lila said. "That's good," he said. "That's very good. I'm going down the road to try to find some groceries. Do you want to come along?" "No." "Okay, you can rest here as long as you feel like," he said. He stepped back and closed the door. Ready for what, he wondered, as he entered the main cabin. "They want to superimpose their movie on you. It's like talking to some religious nut. You can't argue with her. You just have to find some common ground. She was sure a lot better, but there was a long way to go. He wondered if it was safe to leave her alone. There wasn't much else he could do. It was a lot safer at a dock where she might start to interact with people on other boats. God knows what would happen then. The chart showed a road right next to the shore where he could hike or hitchhike about 3 miles south to a place called Highlands of Navesink that might have a grocery store. He got his billfold from a small drawer, filled it with 20s from the wet locker by the chart table, and got out 2 canvas tote bags to carry the groceries. He said goodbye to Lila, and from the deck got down into the dinghy again and rowed ashore. The beach seemed to be grayish fined sand. He stepped out onto the sand and pulled the dinghy way up on the beach, then tied it off to an iron spike sticking out from the end of a large driftwood pole. The junk he'd noticed from the boat was everywhere, and he studied it as he walked to the road. Some glass bottles, a lot of small bleached driftwood pieces, worn around the corners and ends, an inner sole of a shoe, a box with a faded Budweiser label, some old cushions, a wooden toy locomotive. He wondered if he would come across a doll like Lila's, but didn't see any. Farther on was a styrofoam coffee cup, a tire, another coffee cup, some more burned timbers with rusted steel spikes that he had to step over. It all looked worn and bleached and seemed to have drifted in from the bay, not brought by any tourists who were here. It looked too trashy here for tourists. Strange how you could be so close to Manhattan, yet in such a remote rural place. It wasn't rural exactly. It wasn't anything exactly except abandoned. It was a ruins of something. The vegetation was ruins vegetation. Back of the debris were some evergreens that looked like yews or junipers. Other bushes had only a few red leaves left. Still further back were marsh grasses of various species, mostly gold, but still a little green. Off on the far side of the marsh, by an abandoned day beacon, stood a white egret. Feeders found the road where the chart said it would be. Nice asphalt, clean, deserted. He enjoyed the stretch of his legs. The sumac here was just turning red. Another road. How many had he hiked like this? October was a good month for hiking. He walked down the tree and shrub-lined road, feeling sort of marvelous about the fact that somehow he was right here. Dynamic. Lila was talking. That was an accomplishment. It showed he was on the right track. She wasn't making much sense yet with all that talk about the island and Miguel. But that would come in time. The thing was not to force it, not to set up a confrontation. It was an intriguing idea to send someone like Lila to Samoa for a cure, but it wouldn't work. What's wrong with insanity is that she's outside any culture. She's a culture of one. She has her own reality, which no other culture is able to see. That's what had to be reconciled. It could be that if he didn't give her any problems for the next few days, her culture of one might just clear up the whole thing by itself. He wasn't going to send her to any hospital. He knew that now. At the hospital, they'd just start shooting her full of drugs and tell her to adjust. What they wouldn't see is that she is adjusting. That's what the insanity is. She's adjusting to something. The insanity is the adjustment. Insanity isn't necessarily a step in the wrong direction. It can be an intermediate step in the right direction. It wasn't necessarily a disease. It could be part of the cure. He was no expert on the subject, but it seemed to him that the problem of curing an insane person is like the problem of curing a Muslim or curing a communist or curing a Republican or a Democrat. You're not going to make much progress by telling them how wrong they are. If you can convince a mullah that everything will be of higher value if he changes his beliefs to those of Christianity, then a change is not only possible but likely. But if you can't, forget it. And if you can convince Lila that it's more valuable to consider her baby to be a doll than it is to consider her doll to be a baby, then her condition of insanity will be alleviated, but not before. The doll thing was a solution to something, some child thing, but he didn't know what it was. The important thing was to support her delusions and then slowly wean her away from them rather than fight them. The catch here, which almost any philosopher would spot, is the word delusion. It's always the other person who's deluded, or ourselves in the past. Ourselves in the present are never deluded. Delusions can be held by whole groups of people as long as we're not part of that group. If we're a member, then the delusion becomes a minority opinion. An insane delusion can't be held by a group at all. A person isn't considered insane if there are a number of people who believe the same way. Insanity isn't supposed to be a communicable disease. If one other person starts to believe him, or maybe two or three, then it's a religion. Thus, when sane grown men in Italy and Spain carry statues of Christ through the streets, that's not an insane delusion. That's a meaningful religious activity because there are so many of them. But if Lila carries a rubber statue of a child with her wherever she goes, that's an insane delusion because there's only one of her. If you ask a Catholic priest if the wafer he holds at Mass is really the flesh of Jesus Christ, he will say yes. If you ask, do you mean symbolically? He will answer, no, I mean actually. Similarly, if you ask Lila whether the doll she holds is a dead baby, she will say yes. If you ask, do you mean symbolically? She would answer, no, I mean actually. It is considered correct to say that until you understand that the wafer is really the body of Christ, you will not understand the Mass. With equal force, it is possible to say that until you understand that this doll is really a baby, you will never understand Lila. She's a culture of one. She's a religion of one. The main difference is that the Christian, since the time of Constantine, has been supported by huge social patterns of authority. Lila isn't. Lila's religion of one doesn't have a chance. That isn't a completely fair comparison, though. If the major religions of the world consisted of nothing but statues and wafers, and other such paraphernalia, they would have disappeared long ago in the face of scientific knowledge and cultural change, Phaedrus thought. What keeps them going is something else. It sounds quite blasphemous to put religion and insanity on equal footing for comparison, but his point was not to undercut religion, only to illuminate insanity. He thought the intellectual separation of the topic of sanity from the topic of religion has weakened our understanding of both. The current subject-object point of view of religion, conventionally muted so as not to stir up the fanatics, is that religious mysticism and insanity are the same. Religious mysticism is intellectual garbage. It's a vestige of the old superstitious Dark Ages, when nobody knew anything and the whole world was sinking deeper and deeper into filth and disease and poverty and ignorance. It is one of those delusions that isn't called insane only because there are so many people involved. Until quite recently, Oriental religions and Oriental cultures have been similarly grouped as backward, suffering from the disease and poverty and ignorance because they were sunk into a demented mysticism. If it were not for the phenomenon of Japan suddenly leaving the subject-object cultures looking a little backward, the cultural immune system surrounding this view would be impregnable. The metaphysics of quality identifies religious mysticism with dynamic quality. It says the subject-object people are almost right when they identify religious mysticism with insanity. The two are almost the same. Both lunatics and mystics have freed themselves from the conventional static intellectual patterns of their culture. The only difference is that the lunatic has shifted over to a private static pattern of his own, whereas the mystic has abandoned all static patterns in favor of pure dynamic quality. The metaphysics of quality says that as long as the psychiatric approach is encased within a subject-object metaphysical understanding, it will always seek a patterned solution to insanity, never a mystic one. For exactly the same reasons that Choctaw Indians don't distinguish blue from green, and Hindi-speaking people don't distinguish ice from snow, modern psychology cannot distinguish between a patterned reality and an unpatterned reality, and thus cannot distinguish lunatics from mystics. They seem to be the same. When Socrates says, in one of his dialogues, our greatest blessings come to us by way of madness, provided the madness is given us by divine gift, the psychiatric profession doesn't know what in the world he's talking about. Or when traces of this identification are found in the expression touched in the head, meaning touched by God, the roots of this expression are ignored as ignorant and superstitious. In another case of the Cleveland Harbor effect, where you don't see what you don't look for, because when one looks through the record of our culture for connections between insane understanding and religious understanding, one soon finds them everywhere. Even the idea of insanity as possession by the devil can be explained by the metaphysics of quality as a lower biological pattern, the devil, trying to overcome a higher pattern of conformity to cultural belief. The metaphysics of quality suggests that in addition to the customary solutions to insanity, conform to cultural patterns or stay locked up, there is another one. The solution is to dissolve all static patterns, both sane and insane, and find the base of reality, dynamic quality, that is independent of all of them. The metaphysics of quality says that it is immoral for sane people to force cultural conformity by suppressing the dynamic drives that produce insanity. Such suppression is a lower form of evolution trying to devour a higher one. Static social and intellectual patterns are only an intermediate level of evolution. They are good servants of the process of life, but if allowed to turn into masters, they destroy it. Once this theoretical structure is available, it offers solutions to some mysteries in the present treatment of the insane. For example, doctors know that shock treatment works, but are fond of saying that no one knows why. The metaphysics of quality offers an explanation. The value of shock treatment is not that it returns a lunatic to normal cultural patterns. It certainly does not do that. Its value is that it destroys all patterns, both cultural and private, and leaves the patient temporarily in a dynamic state. All the shock does is duplicate the effects of hitting the patient over the head with a baseball bat. It simply knocks him senseless. In fact, it was to imitate the effect of hitting someone over the head with a baseball bat without risk of skull injury that Ugo Cerletti developed shock treatment in the first place. But what goes unrecognized in a subject-object theoretical structure is the fact that this senseless, unpatterned state is a valuable state of existence. Once the patient is in this state, the psychiatrists, of course, don't know what to do with it, and so the patient often slips back into lunacy and has to be knocked senseless again and again. But sometimes the patient, in a moment of Zen wisdom, sees the superficiality of both his own contrary patterns and the cultural patterns, sees that the one gets him electrically clubbed day after day, and the other sets him free from the institution, and thereupon makes a wise mystic decision to get the hell out of there by whatever avenue is available. Another mystery in the treatment of the insane explained by value-centered metaphysics is the value of peace and quiet and isolation. For centuries, that has been the primary treatment of the insane. Leave them alone. Ironically, the one thing the mental hospitals and doctors do best is the one thing they never take credit for. Maybe they're afraid some crusading journalist or other reformer will come along and say, "Look at all those poor crazies in there with nothing to do. Inhuman treatment." So they don't play that part up. They know it works, but there's no way of justifying that because the whole cultural set they have to operate in says doing nothing is the same as doing something wrong. The metaphysics of quality says that what sometimes accidentally occurs in an insane asylum, but occurs deliberately in a mystic retreat, is a natural human process called dhyana in Sanskrit. In our culture, dhyana is ambiguously called meditation. Just as mystics traditionally seek monasteries and ashrams and hermitages as retreats into isolation and silence, so are the insane treated by isolation in places of relative calm and austerity and silence. Sometimes, as a result of this monastic retreat into silence and isolation, the patient arrives at a state Carl Menninger has described as better than cured. He is actually in better condition than he was before the insanity started. Friedrich guessed that in many of these accidental cases, the patient has learned by himself not to cling to any static patterns of ideas, cultural, private, or any other. In the insane asylum, this jhana is underrated and often undermined because there is no metaphysical basis for understanding it scientifically. But among religious mystics, particularly Oriental mystics, jhana has been one of the most intensely studied practices of all. This Western treatment of jhana is a beautiful example of how the static patterns of a culture can make something not exist, even when it does exist. People in this culture are hypnotized into thinking they do not meditate, when in fact they do. Jhana was what this boat was all about. It was what Friedrich had bought it for, a place to be alone and quiet and inconspicuous, and able to settle down into himself, and be what he really was, and not what he was thought to be or was supposed to be. In doing this, he didn't think he was putting the boat to any special purpose. That's what the purpose of boats like this has always been, and seaside cottages too, and lake cabins and hiking trails and golf courses. It's the need for jhana that's behind all these. Vacations too, how perfectly named that is, a vacation, an emptying out. That's what jhana is, an emptying out of all the static clutter and junk of one's life, and just settling into an undefined sort of tranquility. That's what Lila's involved in now, a huge vacation, an emptying out of the junk of her life. She's clinging to some new pattern because she thinks it holds back the old pattern. But what she has to do is take a vacation from all patterns, old and new, and just settle into a kind of emptiness for a while. And if she does, the culture has a moral obligation not to bother her. The most moral activity of all is the creation of space for life to move onward. The metaphysics of quality associates religious mysticism with dynamic quality, but it would certainly be a mistake to think that the metaphysics of quality endorses the static beliefs of any particular religious sect. Fiedrich thought sectarian religion was a static social fallout from dynamic quality, and while some sects had fallen less than others, none of them told the whole truth. His favorite Christian mystic was Johannes Eckhart, who said, "Wouldst thou be perfect, do not yelp about God." Eckhart was pointing to a profound mystic truth, but you can guess what a hand of applause it got from the static authorities of the church. Ill-sounding, rash, and probably heretical was the general verdict. From what Fiedrich had been able to observe, mystics and priests tend to have a cat-and-dog-like coexistence within almost every religious organization. Both groups need each other, but neither group likes the other at all. There's an adage that nothing disturbs a bishop quite as much as the presence of a saint in the parish. It was one of Fiedrich's favorite quotes. The saint's dynamic understanding makes him unpredictable and uncontrollable, but the bishop's got a whole calendar of static ceremonies to attend to, fundraising projects to push forward, bills to pay, parishioners to meet. That saint's going to upend everything if he isn't handled diplomatically. And even then, he may do something wildly unpredictable that upsets everybody. What a quandary. It can take the bishops years, decades, even centuries to put down the hell that a saint can raise in a single day. Joan of Arc is a prime example. In all religions, bishops tend to gild dynamic quality with all sorts of static interpretations because their cultures require it. But these interpretations become like golden vines that cling to a tree, shut out its sunlight, and eventually strangle it. Fiedrich heard the sound of a car coming closer from behind. When it approached, he held out his thumb and it stopped. He told the driver he was looking for groceries, and the driver took him to Atlantic Highlands, where the car was going anyway. At a supermarket, Fiedrich filled the tote bags with all the food he could find that looked good, then found another ride back as far as the junction in the road, where Sandy Hook started. He shouldered the bags, now pretty heavy, hoping another ride would come along, but none came. He thought more about Lila's insanity and how it was related to religious mysticism, and how both were integrated into reason by metaphysics of quality. He thought about how once this integration occurs and dynamic quality is identified with religious mysticism, it produces an avalanche of information as to what dynamic quality is. A lot of this religious mysticism is just low-grade yelping about God, of course. But if you search for the sources of it and don't take the yelps too literally, a lot of interesting things turn up. Long ago, when he first explored the idea of quality, he'd reasoned that if quality were the primordial source of all our understanding, that it followed that the place to get the best view of it would be the beginning of history, when it would have been less cluttered by the present-day deluge of static intellectual patterns of knowledge. He traced quality back to its origins in Greek philosophy and thought he'd gone as far as he could go. Then he found he was able to go back to a time before Greek philosophers, to the rhetoricians. Philosophers usually present their ideas as sprung from nature or sometimes from God, but Fiedrich thought neither of these was completely accurate. The logical order of things which the philosophers study is derived from the mythos. The mythos is the social culture and the rhetoric, which the culture must invent before philosophy becomes possible. Most of this old religious talk is nonsense, of course, but nonsense or not, it is the parent of our modern scientific talk. The mythos over logos thesis agreed with the metaphysics of quality's assertion that the intellectual static patterns of quality are built up out of social static patterns of quality. Digging back into ancient Greek history, to the time when this mythos to logos transition was taking place, Fiedrich noticed that the ancient rhetoricians of Greece, the sophists, had taught what they called arete, which was a synonym for quality. Victorians had translated arete as virtue, but Victorian virtue connoted sexual abstinence, prissiness, and a holier-than-thou snobbery. This was a long way from what the ancient Greeks meant. The early Greek literature, particularly the poetry of Homer, showed that arete had been a central and vital term.
With Homer, Phaedrus was certain he'd gone back as far as he could go, but one day he came across some information that startled him. It said that by following linguistic analysis, you could go even further back into the Mythos than Homer. Ancient Greek was not an original language. It was descended from a much earlier one, now called the Proto IndoEuropean language. This language has left no fragments, but has been derived by scholars from similarities between such languages as Sanskrit, Greek, and English, which have indicated that these languages were fallouts from a common prehistoric tongue. After thousands of years of separation from Greek and English, the Hindi word for mother is still ma. Yoga both looks like and is translated as yoke. The reason an Indian Raja's title sounds like regent is because both terms are fallouts from Proto IndoEuropean. Today, a Proto IndoEuropean dictionary contains more than 1,000 entries, with derivations extending into more than 100 languages. Just for curiosity's sake, Phaedrus decided to see if arete was in it. He looked under the A words and was disappointed to find it was not. Then he noted a statement that said that the Greeks were not the most faithful to the Proto-Indo-European spelling. Among other sins, the Greeks added the prefix to many of the Proto-Indo-European roots. He checked this out by looking for arete under R. This time a door opened. The Proto-Indo-European root of arete was the morpheme rt, urt. There, besides arete, was a treasure room of other derived urt words: arithmetic, aristocrat, art, rhetoric, worth, right, ritual, right, right-handed, and right correct. All of these words except arithmetic seem to have a vague thesaurus-like similarity to quality. Phaedrus studied them carefully, letting them soak in, trying to guess what sort of concept, what sort of way of seeing the world could give rise to such a collection. When the morpheme appeared in aristocrat and arithmetic, the reference was to firstness. Fit meant first. When it appeared in art and right, W-R-I-G-H-T, it seemed to mean created and of beauty. Ritual suggested repetitive order. And the word right, R-I-G-H-T, has two meanings, right-handed and moral and aesthetic correctness. When all these meanings were strung together, a fuller picture of the RT, urt, morpheme emerged. RT referred to the first created, beautiful, repetitive order of moral and aesthetic correctness. Interestingly, in the sciences today, arithmetic still enjoys this status. Later, Phaedrus discovered that even though the Hebrews were from across the river and not part of the Proto-Indo-European group, they had a similar term, arheton, which meant the one, and which was considered so sacred it was not allowed to be spoken. The right-handedness was also interesting. He had come across an anthropology book called La prééminence de la main droite by Robert Hertz, showing how condemnation of left-handedness as sinister is an almost universal anthropological characteristic. Our modern 20th century culture is one of the few exceptions, but even today when illegal oaths are taken, or when military salutes are given, or people shake hands, or when a president is inaugurated and agrees to uphold the first created beautiful repetitive order of moral and aesthetic correctness of his country, it is mandatory that he raise his right hand. When school children pledge allegiance to the flag as a symbol of this tribal beauty and moral correctness, they are required to do the same thing. Prehistoric RT, urt, is still with us. There was just one thing wrong with this Proto-European discovery, something Phaedrus had tried to sweep under the carpet at first, but which kept creeping out again. The meanings, grouped together, suggested something different from his interpretation of arete. They suggested importance, but it was an importance that was so formal and social and procedural and manufactured, almost an antonym to the quality he was talking about. RT meant quality, all right, but the quality it meant was static, not dynamic. He had wanted it to come out the other way, but it looked as though it wasn't going to do it. Ritual. That was the last thing he wanted arete to turn out to be. Bad news. It looked as though the Victorian translation of arete's virtue might be better after all, since virtue implies ritualistic conformity to social protocol. It was in this gloomy mood, while he was thinking about all the interpretations of the RT morpheme, that yet another find came. He had thought that surely this time he had reached the end of the quality arete-RT trail. But then, from the sediment of old memories, his mind dredged up a word he hadn't thought of for a long time. Ruta. It was a Sanskrit word, and Fetus remembered what it meant. Ruta was the cosmic order of things. Then he remembered that he had read that the Sanskrit language was considered the most faithful to the Proto IndoEuropean root, probably because the linguistic patterns had been so carefully preserved by the Hindu priests. Ruta came surrounded by memory of bright chalky tan walls in a classroom filled with sun. At the head of the classroom, Mr. Mukherjee, a perspiring dhoti-clad Brahmin, was drilling dozens of ancient Sanskrit words into the assembled students' heads. Advaita, Maya, Avidya, Brahman, Atman, Prajna, Samkhya, Visistadvaita, Rigveda, Upanishad, Darsana, Jnana, Jnana, and so on. He introduced them day after day, each in turn with a little smile that promised hundreds more to come. At Fetus's worn wooden desk near the wall in the back of the classroom, he had sat sweaty and annoyed by buzzing flies. The heat and light and flies came and went freely through openings in a wall which had no window glass because in India you don't need it. His notebook was damp where his hand had rested. His pen wouldn't write on the damp spot, so he had to write around it. When he turned the page, he found the damp had gotten through to the next page, too. In the heat, it was agony to remember what all the words were supposed to mean. Ajiva, moksha, kama, ahimsa, susupti, bhakti, samsara. They passed by his mind like clouds and disappeared. Through the openings in the wall, he could see real clouds, giant monsoon clouds towering thousands of feet up, and white-humped Sindhi cows grazing below. He thought he'd forgotten all those words years ago. But now here it was, Ruta, back again, Ruta, from the oldest portion of the Rig Veda, which was the oldest known writing of the Indo-Aryan language. The sun god, Surya, began his chariot ride across the heavens from the abode of Ruta. Varuna, the god for whom the city in which Phaedrus was studying was named, was the chief support of Ruta. Varuna was omniscient and was described as ever witnessing the truth and falsehood of men, as being the third whenever two plot in secret. He was essentially a god of righteousness and a guardian of all that is worthy and good. The text had said that the distinctive feature of Varuna was his unswerving adherence to high principles. Later he was overshadowed by Indra, who was a thunder god and the destroyer of the enemies of the Indo-Aryans. But all the gods were conceived of as guardians of Ruta, willing the right and making sure it was carried out. One of Phaedrus's old school texts, written by M. Hirayana, contained a good summary. Ruta, which etymologically stands for course, originally meant cosmic order, the maintenance of which was the purpose of all the gods, and later it also came to mean right, so that the gods were conceived as preserving the world not merely from physical disorder, but also from moral chaos. The one idea is implicit in the other, and there is order in the universe because its control is in righteous hands. The physical order of the universe is also the moral order of the universe. Ruta is both. This was exactly what the metaphysics of quality was claiming. It was not a new idea. It was the oldest known to man. The identification of Ruta and arete was enormously valuable, Phaedrus thought, because it provided a huge historical panorama in which the fundamental conflict between static and dynamic quality had been worked out. It answered the question of why arete meant ritual. Ruta also meant ritual, but unlike the Greeks, the Hindus, in their many thousands of years of cultural evolution, had paid enormous attention to the conflict between ritual and freedom. The resolution of this conflict in the Buddhist and Vedantist philosophies is one of the profound achievements of the human mind. The original meaning of Ruta during what is called the Vardhamana period of Indian history underwent a change to extremely ritualistic static patterns, more rigid and detailed than anything heard of in Western religion. And Hirayana wrote, "The purpose of invoking the several gods of nature was at first mostly to gain their favor for success in life, here as well as hereafter. The prayers were then naturally accompanied by simple gifts like grain and ghee. But this simple form of worship became more and more complicated and gave rise in course of time to elaborate sacrifices and also to a special class of professional priests who alone, it was believed, could officiate at them. There were allusions in the later hymns to rites which lasted for very long periods and at which several priests were employed by the sacrificer. A change came over the spirit with which offerings were made to the gods in this period. What prompted the performance of sacrifices was no longer the thought of prevailing upon the gods to bestow some favor or ward off some danger. It was rather to compel or coerce them to do what the sacrificer wanted to be done. There was a profound change in the conception of sacrifice and consequently in that of the relation between gods and men. All that came to be insisted upon was a scrupulous carrying out of every detail connected with the various rites, and the good result accruing from them, whether here or elsewhere, was believed to follow automatically from it. Ritualistic punctilio thus comes to be placed on the same level as natural law and moral rectitude. You don't have to look far in the modern world to find similar conditions, Fiedler's thought. But what made the Hindu experience so profound was that this decay of dynamic quality into static quality was not the end of the story. Following the period of Brahmanas came the Upanishadic period and the flowering of Indian philosophy. Dynamic quality reemerged within the static patterns of Indian thought. Ruta, Hirayana had written, almost ceased to be used in Sanskrit, but under the name of Dharma, the same idea occupies a very important place in later Indian views of life also. The more usual meaning of Dharma is religious merit which, operating in some unseen way as it is supposed, secures good to a person in the future, either here or elsewhere. Thus, the performance of certain sacrifices is believed to lead the agent to heaven after the present life, and of certain others to secure for him wealth, children, and the like in this very life. But he also wrote, it is sometimes used as a purely moral concept and stands for right or virtuous conduct, which leads to some form of good as a result. Dharma, like Ruta, means what holds together. It is the basis of all order. It equals righteousness. It is the ethical code. It is the stable condition which gives man perfect satisfaction. Dharma is a duty. It is not external duty, which is arbitrarily imposed by others. It is not any artificial set of conventions which can be amended or repealed by legislation. Neither is it an internal duty, which is arbitrarily decided by one's own conscience. Dharma is beyond all questions of what is internal and what is external. Dharma is quality itself, the principle of lightness, which gives structure and purpose to the evolution of all life and to the evolving understanding of the universe which life has created. Within the Hindu tradition, Dharma is relative and dependent on the conditions of society. It always has a social implication. It is the bond which holds society together. It is fitting to the ancient origins of the term. But within modern Buddhist thought, Dharma becomes the phenomenal world, the object of perception, thought, or understanding. A chair, for example, is not composed of atoms of substance. It is composed of dharmas. This statement is absolutely jabberwocky to a conventional subject-object metaphysics. How can a chair be composed of individual little moral orders? But if one applies the metaphysics of quality and sees that a chair is an inorganic static pattern, and sees that all static patterns are composed of value, and that value is synonymous with morality, then it all begins to make sense. It occurred to Fiedler that this was one answer, perhaps the basic answer, to why workmen in Japan and Taiwan and other areas in the Far East are able to maintain quality levels that compare so favorably to those in the West. In the past, the mystics' traditional low regard for inorganic static patterns, laws of nature, has kept the scientifically derived technology of these cultures poor. But since Orientals have learned to overcome that prejudice, times have changed. If one comes from a cultural tradition where an electronic assembly is primarily a moral order rather than just a neutral pile of substance, it is easier to feel an ethical responsibility for doing good work on it. Fiedler thought that Oriental social cohesiveness and ability to work long, hard hours without complaint was not a genetic characteristic but a cultural one. It resulted from the working out, centuries ago, of the problem of Dharma, and in the way in which it combines freedom and ritual. In the West, progress seems to proceed by a series of spasms of alternating freedom and ritual. A revolution of freedom against old rituals produces a new order, which soon becomes another old ritual for the next generation to revolt against, on and on. In the Orient, there are plenty of conflicts, but historically this particular kind of conflict has not been as dominant. Feeders thought it was because Dharma includes both static and dynamic quality without contradiction. For example, you would guess from the literature on Zen and its insistence on discovering the unwritten Dharma that it would be intensely anti-ritualistic, since ritual is the written Dharma. But that isn't the case. The Zen monk's daily life is nothing but one ritual after another, hour after hour, day after day, all his life. They don't tell him to shatter those static patterns to discover the unwritten Dharma. They want him to get those patterns perfect. The explanation for this contradiction is the belief that if you do not free yourself from static patterns by fighting them with other contrary static patterns, that is sometimes called bad karma chasing its tail. You free yourself from static patterns by putting them to sleep. That is, you master them with such proficiency that they become an unconscious part of your nature. You get so used to them, you completely forget they are gone. There in the center of the most monotonous boredom of static ritualistic patterns, the dynamic freedom is found. Feeders saw nothing wrong with this ritualistic religion as long as the rituals are seen as merely a static portrayal of dynamic quality, a signpost which allows socially pattern-dominated people to see dynamic quality. The danger has always been that the rituals, the static patterns, are mistaken for what they merely represent, and allowed to destroy the dynamic quality they were originally intended to preserve. Suddenly the foliage by the road opened up, and there it was, the ocean. He stopped for a second by the beach and just stared at the endless procession of waves moving slowly in from the horizon. The south wind was stronger here, and it cooled him. It was steady like a trade wind. Nothing interfered with its flow toward him over the huge ocean. Vast emptiness and nothing sacred. If ever there was a visible concrete metaphor for dynamic quality, this was it. The beach looked much cleaner here than on the other side of the hook, and he would have liked to walk for a while, but he had to get back to the boat and to Lila. Where to start with her? That was the question. The Ruta interpretation of quality would say that more ritual is what she needs. Not the kind of ritual that fights dynamic quality, but the kind that embodies it. But what ritual? She wasn't about to follow rituals of any kind. Ritual was what she was fighting. But that could be an answer. Lila's problem wasn't that she was suffering from lack of dynamic freedom. It's hard to see how she could possibly have any more freedom. What she needed now were stable patterns to encase that freedom. She needed some way of being reintegrated into the rituals of everyday living. But where to start? That doll, maybe. She had to give up that doll. She wasn't going to convert anyone to that religion. The longer she hung on to it, the firmer the static pattern was likely to get. These defensive patterns were not only as bad as the patterns she was running from, they were worse. Now she's got two sets of patterns to break away from, the culture's and her own. He wondered if it was possible to put these defensive patterns to sleep by means of the doll. Just accept the idea that the doll is her real child and treat the doll in such a way as to quiet down all those longings. She says the doll, her baby, is dead. She thinks this is some sort of island. Why not bury the doll with full honors? That would be a ritual, Feeders thought. That's exactly what Lila needs. Don't fight her patterns. Amalgamate them. She already seemed to think of him as some sort of priestly figure. Why disappoint her? He could use this image to try to bury her insane patterns with the baby. That would be sort of theatrical and fake, he supposed, but that's what funerals were. Theater. They weren't for the corpse, certainly, but to help end the longings and old patterns of the living, who had to go on. The funeral would be real to Lila. That baby probably embodied just about every care she had. Ruta. That's what was missing from her life. Ritual. Arriving at work Monday morning is Ruta. Getting paid Friday evening is Ruta. Walking to the grocery store and taking food off the shelf to feed one's children is Ruta. Paying for it with the money received on Friday is more Ruta. The entire mechanism of society is Ruta from beginning to end. That's what Lila really needed. He could only guess how far back this ritual-cosmos relationship went, maybe 50 or 100,000 years. Cavemen are usually depicted as hairy, stupid creatures who don't do much, but anthropological studies of contemporary primitive tribes suggest that Stone Age people were probably bound by ritual all day long. There's a ritual for washing, for putting up a house, for hunting, for eating, and so on. So much so that the division between ritual and knowledge becomes indistinct. In cultures without books, ritual seems to be a public library for teaching the young and preserving common values and information. These rituals may be the connecting link between the social and intellectual levels of evolution. One can imagine primitive song rituals and dance rituals associated with certain cosmology stories, myths, which generated the first primitive religions. From these, the first intellectual truths could have been derived. If ritual always comes first and intellectual principles always come later, then ritual cannot always be a decadent corruption of the intellect. Their sequence in history suggests that principles emerge from ritual, not the other way around. That is, we don't perform religious rituals because we believe in God. We believe in God because we perform religious rituals. If so, that's an important principle in itself. But after a while, as Friedrich walked along, his enthusiasm for the baby funeral started to go downhill. He didn't like this idea of going along with some ritual he didn't really believe in. He had a feeling that real ritual had to grow out of your own nature. It isn't something that can be intellectualized and patched on. The funeral would be a pretense. How are you going to bring someone back to reality when the reality you bring them back to is a deliberate fake? That's no good. He had never gone along with the fakery in the mental hospital, and he's sure it wouldn't work now. Santa Claus stuff. Sooner or later, the lie breaks down. And then, what's your next move? Friedrich continued to think about it, leaning first one way, then another, until he got a sign that indicated he was back at Horseshoe Cove. When the cove came into view, his boat was there all right, but another boat was alongside of it, rafted on. A wave of very unmystic anxiety came over him.